Hey, everybody, welcome back. I hope that you're having a beautiful and blessed day today. I'm here with Rob Davis. We are going through his book, Purpose in Form, the necessary basis of all ethics. We are chapter 9, episode 10 of our walkthrough. Last week we covered chapter 8, the Christian ethic. And now we are on chapter 9, Metaphysics of Mind, the Order of Mental Virtues. How are you doing today, Rob? I'm doing great.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yep.
Okay. Could you please provide us just kind of a general overview of what the chapter is about?
Yeah, this is in some ways an expansion on one point from the last chapter. So we talked about the Christian ethic overall, and one of the things I touched on in there was that we don't have to know the good from the outset. Like that sounds like such a crazy standard to say, oh, we need to start acting in accordance with the good. Like, well, yeah, but okay, but what is the good? How do we know that? But one thing I touch on in the chapter previous is showing that actually we do know at least step one, and that's get in touch with the truth. And so in a way, this chapter is an expansion on that topic and sort of a doubling down and a secondary proof to say again, hey, the most foundational one of our virtues, at least in the realm of mind, of intellect, and any sphere connected with that, is going to be the truth. So um, it's really just a way to hammer home that idea, to provide some arguments about responding to people who don't believe in the truth or think there's multiple truths or whatever it is. All those just fall apart and are self-contradictory. And then just showing how the the truth is the underlying foundation of all of our systems, and how we and then that comes back around to, well, even if we don't know the truth, we step one is seek the truth and value it above everything else. So that's the broadest overview.
So how would you classify truth? In the opening of the chapter, you identified truth as being virtuous and also as that it is as foundational as meaning. Could you kind of touch on that and just kind of the importance of truth and what it is?
Yeah. So the issue with truth, just like the issue with meaning, or really foundational words like belief um, or something that is one of our core principles that we take for granted. There's not really a way. Definitions are sort of more difficult at that point because it's just something so intuitive. So, for example, when you try to define meaning, like earlier in the book, I made an effort to define meaning, and I just sort of had to throw out a bunch of synonyms and say meaning is like significance, meaning is like purpose, meaning is, there's no, like, what is meaning in itself. And the same thing happens with truth, because essentially, if you're saying what is truth, you're saying what's the truth of truth, like, because you have to have a true definition for it to be a real definition. And then if you're defining truth, now you have to point at the thing that makes the definition true for the definition of truth. So it becomes circular in that sense. But what we can see through just reflection is that truth is that foundation. Truth is essential, and everything assumes truth. So, for example, quite simply, if someone is to say there is no truth, or truth isn't the highest value, the classic point is that has to be a true statement. You have to say it is, like, there's no absolute truth. Okay, well, unless that statement itself is absolutely true, then it is not meaningful. And so it contradicts itself. So, but another way to think about it is, if we were to say, for whatever reason, we just got this wild idea in our heads, if we were to say that truth wasn't something good, that untruth, for whatever reason, like, or lack of truth, was the superordinate and definite reality. That was the thing that really reflected reality. Well, then we're just saying that untruth is truth because the correspondence, the reflection of reality is sort of what we're talking about with truth. So as long as we think that we can point to something and say something, as long as we think that our statements have meaning, then anything coherent, anything substantive, anything significant presupposes that truth exists. So just like without meaning, there's no point in talking about anything. Without truth, don't even get started with anything. There's nothing to say.
So if we were to look at a truth like a mathematical equation, 2 + 2 = 4, but then we're looking at something else, maybe we're tying something in with faith, um, where we just know something to be true through discernment or through knowing. Do you think that that level of truth is as foundational and solid as a mathematical equation like 2 + 2 = 4?
Well, the thing that I'm saying is foundational is not one type or the other.
Yeah.
It's the concept of truth itself.
Okay.
So there could be various arguments for whatever intuition versus analytic truth, but I'm talking about the existence of truth itself and the
Truth
principle
itself.
of truth itself. So what is foundational is that whatever your opinion, when you're speaking about those cases and you're trying to make your case for the one that you believe, you are appealing to the universal idea of truth.
Right. Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm not making a claim that there's that we can know that sort of stuff, that like there has to be equal value in truth no matter where you find it, or there doesn't have, I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just saying truth exists
Right.
and coming and it's the foundation to everything.
And then so as truth exists, make of that what you will, but you know that it exists.
Yeah, at least for now, just for step one,
Step one. Yeah.
let's agree on the fact that truth exists, because if we don't, then there's no point in talking.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
How does our mental virtues, like what are mental virtues and how would they be ordered?
So I use that as a title, the order of mental virtues, and um, essentially that's a way of saying some people. It's kind of an odd use of the word virtues. In a way, it means power in this sense, like capacity or power. Um, so the aspects of the mind that I talk about, and this is really just a um, an illustration rather than a definitive, like, here are the mental virtues and you must accept them. But it's an illustration of to get us to that point where we can see all the better that truth is the foundation. And so I use the idea of truth, of reason, and of intellect. And then I break down a little bit in between there too. But basically, I consider the question of like, okay, well, we really value the intellect. And the intellect is what allows us to access truth, at least in the mental realm. So would it make sense to say that the intellect is the superior function, the superior virtue? Is intellect um, more foundational than truth, since we need it to get truth? Does truth depend on the intellect? And same thing with reason. Does reason depend on the intellect and or on truth? Is it the highest thing? And what is sort of the order there? And I walk through a couple scenarios that hopefully demonstrate the issues with ordering things in a different way and how that can lead us astray, and why truth is that foundation and does have to be the come out on top, regardless of the claims from our perspective, where we think intellect is our key to the purpose. That doesn't negate the fact that is uh, truth is superordinate.
What would that relationship look like between truth, reason, and intellect? So like our side of it would be the intellect that is then in search of truth through reason. So truth would be somewhat of kind of the gravitator that pulls somebody's intellect to it if they're in search of reason, if they're reasoning. It kind of you inevitably get drawn in that direction, not necessarily in a straight linear line, but kind of a meandering way. Because again, and I believe you point out in this chapter as well, the fallibility of humans and humans reason, and therefore reasoning is fallible. So could you kind of touch on that in a little more depth in terms of their individual relationship to one another?
Yeah. So even there, you've sort of uh, we don't usually think of the intellect as being drawn by the gravity of truth. We usually think of ourselves as intellecting or whatever, right? Thinking. So yeah, there's this perception that, well, my intellect leads me to the truth. So you could easily take that and say, therefore, it's intellect, and then off of that is built reason, and then off of that we find the truth. Um, the problem with that is that one, the intellect does depart from the truth and depart from reason and serves other functions within our soul, you might say, within our set of desires. Um, and I think from the other side, it's kind of like, let's go back to the math example. Like our intellect does math. Like we can do math with the intellect. But unless unless there's a weird way to say it, but unless quantity exists, numbers, we might say. Numbers are, when we think of numbers, we think of the symbol, but the idea behind that of the existent quantity of one or two and the relationships between them, unless that exists, then us moving towards and trying to figure out mathematical stuff with our intellects is void and is not going to work. So there has to be the reality behind it of numbers and quantity and their relations. And then um, we have to have a capacity to access that. But our capacity to access that and comprehend it is not the foundational component of the existence of quantity. So, in the same way, with truth and reason, we have the capacity to reason, which is founded in our intellect, and that can allow us to move towards the truth, but that doesn't make the truth exist. The truth is there, and then we have the capacity to access it. If the truth didn't exist, there would be no difference between assuming for whatever reason that we existed and had minds, which is nonsensical, but pretending for a second that the truth just didn't exist and we had minds, then there would be no distinction between reasoning and sophistry or intellectual machination of any kind, because there's not the underlying reality that is the goal of the process. So while we think of it sort of from our end up, I think the reality is that we need to understand that the goal of our intellect is actually, in a sense, the source of our intellect. It's a weird way to think of it, but the 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 highest goal of our intellect is to reach the truth. So, in that sense, the truth is what that true goal, that foundational goal, that highest aspiration is the reason and the source of the existence of the intellect. That messes with our concepts of time and linearity and that sort of stuff. But I think it is true.
I like how you describe that the bottom up approach because it shows of like you stated that truth is the highest virtue, but then we also have the ability to seek it out or not. So there's
Mhm.
some responsibility with the individual intellect. Would would it be amiss to say that the intellect is the ego and that it's our way of functioning in reality? It's our way of interacting and interfacing on a conscious level. I guess maybe on with an aspect of that conscious level with the I am, we have the ability to think that we are the greatest source of energy, that we are all that is. And I believe that you get into what is that term, solipsism?
Mhm.
It gets rampant, or the ego or the intellect kind of runs wild with that. Would you say that that's a good comparison, or at least one that makes sense?
Yeah, I see the overlap there. I think from a technical point of view, the intellect and the ego are going to be separate things, and depending on what school of thought you are with the ego. But certainly the ego, if you take it as your overall, what do we say, overall perception of yourself and your own desires, you can certainly have an ego that is worshiping its own intellect, and in that sense, sort of thinks of itself as primarily the intellect. So there can be that perceived overlap, but the intellect isn't even in the realm of cognitive science. The intellect isn't even all of the processes of the mind. So in terms of technicality, there might be a difference.
Difference. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because there was and I wish I had that. I wish I had that line pulled up here where you make a similar comparison. Um, but one statement that you made here that I really like that kind of ties in reason with truth is truth exists, reason serves and leads to truth, and the intellect serves and leads to reason. Um, because it kind of differentiates truth and reason from the intellect as our capacity to seek out truth through reason is in our hands via the intellect. Um, would you say that what's the relationship between consciousness and the intellect?
Oh, well, similarly to how, so again, if we're using intellect in a technical term within the fields of sort of cognitive science, then the intellect is very like a specific process of your mind, or of your brain, and then you have other unconscious processes, and you have intuitive processes and uh, other stuff. I'm not total expert on that, but uh, then if you're going to differentiate, some people would even differentiate consciousness from what we think of in modern terms as mind. So, as we talked about before, some of your consciousness comes from your gut microbiome, even just on the biological level. So, consciousness is, I would say, is your ability, the capacity of awareness, your perception, the fact that you are aware of things and note them, and there's a, yeah, experience of noting things. Then the mind is sort of the smaller aspect of consciousness that, um, what would we say, focuses on organizable things, maybe like comprehensible things. And then within that, there would be like the intellect, which is like the mental computer that does processes and even more direct and fine-tuned, like very systematic processes.
More analytical.
Right. Yeah.
Um, where would the I am come from? Is that maybe tied to a specific aspect of consciousness, or is that just an kind of overarching, all enveloping?
Um, well, it's hard to say because I don't know that there's a you'd you need a definition of the I am. You need to say, here's what I mean by the I am, and know that it's the same between people.
Yeah.
So I mean, personally, when I hear that word, I think consciousness. I think the basic capacity of awareness, that noticing uh, aspect that's aware that it's noticing. But then even that, you might have to step behind. If by I am, I think we've used it a couple times in previous podcasts, and it's somewhat connected to the ego. So that might be a step further in where it's not just I'm aware that I'm aware, but I'm aware of a particular cohesive experience of a limited being that has sort of a story going on. So whether if you mean I am by like I particular me am, that's one thing versus I am in the sense of there is a conscious presence that is aware, but isn't necessarily connected to a particular story.
Very well said. That's yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, and we have used that in prior podcasts, and I think it was more an association to the ego aspect, like our persona, you know.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, you also talk about, and I'll just go ahead and read this and ask you to elaborate a little bit. You speak of truth as, or some at least maybe would come up with this idea. I mean, I think it's easy to say that truth is a binary option. Truth versus untrue is not true. A lot of people think that. Um, what is the meta truth?
Mhm. Yeah. So you'll hear sort of a common phrase. Maybe it's not quite as common as it was a couple years ago, but um, that reality is not binary or, slightly different situation, but now gender is not binary. But people would talk about truth as not binary. There's not truth versus untruth. There's, multiple truths. Um, The issue there is really the same issue that is pointed out at the beginning, but just sort of cropping up in a different lens or a different valence. So if your claim is that there are multiple truths, that is a claim that needs to be either true or false. So by introducing this confusion or this muddying of the waters, people get confused, but they just don't realize that you've just bumped the reality up a level. So, even if you want to make a basic claim of like, I don't know, I'm going to use something silly that is not really what they're talking about, but like sometimes this table's in darkness, sometimes it's in light, sometimes it's in half light. So therefore, there's multiple truths to what it is. Okay, but the variableness of reality doesn't change the fact that we're still looking for a truth. And in this case, when someone says the truth is not binary, they're either making a true claim or they're not. So really what we have to see is that there's always going to be that meta level where even if someone's making a claim for multiple competing truths, and even in cases where they're trying to make it about the same thing at the same time in the same respect, they're essentially trying to find a situation where you can violate the law of non-contradiction, as it's referred to in logic. Um, they are still making a claim that is either true or false. They're saying this is the way it is. This is I'm describing to you the reflection of reality, and it is this way. It comes out that there are multiple truths. Okay. but that is either true or false. Because if it's true, okay, on that level, but we've still decided that it's a truth and we still know what we're talking about when we talk about truth. Versus if that claim is false, then we don't need to worry about it. So there's still that meta level where you have the binary. There's always going to be that binary. And then the other thing to see is that when someone is saying that there are multiple truths or that we can violate the law of non-contradiction, something can be both one thing and its opposite at the same time. What they're really saying is not that truth is multiple. They're saying that truth doesn't exist, that there is no truth, that uh, the thing that we're calling uh, that reflection of reality is not reliable, effervescent, mutable, and so therefore isn't in any case what we are claiming it to be. And again, the problem with that is they're claiming that to be true. They're claiming to be able to see a reflection of reality that is constant and that they can report to you, and that's truth. So it's self-contradictory in that sense. But yeah.
Because you're attributing meaning when you're saying that something is the truth, you're attributing meaning to that, whatever it is that you're claiming.
Mhm.
That then goes against the nihilistic belief that there is no meaning, therefore there is no truth. But if that metric is true of let's say, okay, well, we are on a uh planet and we're hurtling around the solar system and we're in the United States, that's true in the moment. So if people you are using the claim of well, in the grand scheme of humanity, or in you're trying to objectify it or enlarge it in such a way to minuscule to simplify the truth or to minimize it to the point to where it's irrelevant or meaningless. I mean, you could do that, but at the same time, I think that just by engaging in that way, by putting mental effort into it, you are attributing meaning to some level simply to try to refute truth and meaning in the first place. So it's kind of a
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only way that that ever really gains ground is through the sort of argument about how we've come to understand our perceptions are fallible. And people will go into all how bad our biases are and how, cultures have disagreed about things and blah, blah, blah. And so, like that, I think that's uh, the entire underlying case is something along those lines of like, we can't really know and we're flawed. And so we actually don't have the capacity to tell what is true and what's not. So we have to act as though there's no truth,
right.
whatever that means. So the issue with that, as you were pointing out, is, well, we have to actually make the case through extended observation, study, statistics, blah, 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 that we are unreliable truth seekers. And then you have to transmit that case to another person and say, it is the case, it is true that we are fallible and that we are so bad at seeking the truth, we never really find it, and it's probably not there anyway. Like you're still, like you're saying, investing meaning and going on a mental journey to try and find something that is reflective of reality that you're passing on to someone else that you think they will find also reflective of reality, and that should determine your actions. Like that's truth. That means that you think you've found a truth and you're sharing it with someone else, and you think that the truth should guide your actions. So you're still functioning based on the truth. You're still saying that the truth should determine how you act, and you're still assuming that we have the ability to um, perceive some level of realities in the world in order to get to the place where you're trying to make the case that we can't perceive realities in the world. So we either
Exactly.
can or we can't. If we can't, then there's no point in talking. There's no meaning. We don't even exist, whatever. Like there's just nothing. Just get rid of it. But if, again, sort of like I said in the last chapter, we're not choosing between humans have no hope of reaching the truth, and humans are perfect uh, expositors of the truth at all times. We're choosing between humans have no hope of reaching the truth and the truth probably doesn't exist, or the truth is worth pursuing even though we're going to screw it up a lot. And again, some people are still arguing for the idea of, well, the truth doesn't exist, even when the other option is like the broadest landscape you could possibly give it of like, yeah, we're going to screw it up. We're not good. We're, we're terrible at this, but we have some amount of capacity to find the truth, and it's worth pursuing. That's all you have to put on the other side. You don't have to go any further than that. You could say that, you could still say, I believe that we have some capacity because I'm going to talk to you about it and I believe in meaning, but I believe that we are never going to get to a place where we're certain. We're never going to get anywhere close to something that we should, act on as a collective species because it's so uncertain. It's so culturally relative. Like that all fits within that camp of, yes, we have some ability to find the truth. And yes, it's worthwhile, even though we'll never get there. And this other camp of there's no truth is just non-existent. It's nonsensical. But people are pulled that way by that underlying story, even though, as we're pointing out, they don't notice the contradictions of like you're still dependent on truth while you're doing that to get to the place where you think there's no truth.
So people's truth can be untruth if they so want it to be. I guess that just shows kind of the wackadoo nature of the whole thing. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I want to make a connection, just kind of brainstorm here for a second. Last chapter, I believe it was last chapter, we talked about causality, and always looking at progress as potentially incremental, right? We have to if this, then that, input, output. And so there's a lot of fallibility, there's a lot of mistakes made, there's a lot of failures, but over time, you start to naturally get to an order or get to a truth. Would that kind of would that all of that tie in together in saying we are made in the image of the Lord. The Lord is order. We are seeking to change things that are chaotic into orderly things or abate chaos from infringing upon the order. And that order is found through the fallible nature of causality and reasoning. With it, maybe I'm at the end there. I kind of lost it, but is there a connection there with that?
Yeah, definitely. So um, this just makes me think of in the beginning was the word, and the word for word there is logos. And logos doesn't just mean um, spoken word. It doesn't just mean textual word. It means like the the pattern of understanding, like the it means the like the underlying reality that allows us to understand a sequence of words. The fact that we can look at a sentence and that has meaning, that principle is what is being talked about with logos. And so that principle of, like you were saying, ordered cohesiveness, the capacity to understand was there at the beginning. So um, that is, and then that connects to us and this concept of truth because there's truth out there. And like I was saying earlier, we have to have some capacity to access it. So we think of like intellect for ourselves, but even prior to that, uh, especially from the Christian model, speaking in these terms, like our soul has to possess an aspect of the logos. We have to be um, logos beings. We have to be we're patterned our all beings are patterned by the logos, but we have to be participators in the logos in order to spot that pattern um, across the spectrum of patterns and not just see chaos, but to be able to draw out the pattern um, and see things the way they are patterned. So yeah, it ties right in that we have that capacity within ourselves, and that is what makes us imagers of God, is that we participate in the logos.
Yeah, and I think of us being order. We are an order of cells, of molecules, of atoms. And I mean, it's like kind of looking at, when was that? A year or two ago, where there was that dress, and people were
Yeah,
asking if it was yellow or if it was blue. It's like people can look at life and say, okay, well, this was just a natural gravitation, random happenstance where there was some form of order that came out of chaos. And therefore, over time, you just through just random happenstance, we've become what we are over time, as opposed to looking at just the divine order of existence as a whole, uh, and how everything just fits into place. I mean, you can look. I mean, if you want, you can hold on to that and completely disregard divine order, but it to me, it's clear as day, and I think maybe that's just a strong difference of opinion. Uh, with people that I guess in many situations those opinions are very dogmatic, because you're almost infringing on somebody's core belief system and how they've constructed reality using their intellect. So when you come in there and try to interject and throw a 180 on them, they might not take that too kindly. But how would you say is would be an effective way to, and I know that this book is a huge aspect of it, and this is, one way to do it, to maybe talk to people that might uphold those dogmatic beliefs and try to get them, um, to think of things a little differently.
I think that the book is what I hope is a answer, and I hope it's effective for some people. But I think that there are multiple ways to go about it. Um, so I mean, this book is written for intellectuals. I'm an intellectual. I'm aware that not everybody is an intellectual, and to a lot of people, this book is not the most effective way of going about it. So, like for example, I really like the book Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, and I don't agree with everything he says, but I like his presentation. The graphs are amazing, and it moves me as a book. I'm like, wow, this is great. I am also aware that people will read that and be like, yeah, whatever, graphs, math, I believe what I believe. Like people aren't influenced by the same sort of approach. So, so I think there's more than one way to go about it. Well, how do you get someone to realize it? Well, I think broadly speaking, we would split it into two groups. So there's one, you're either going to go the realm of thinking about it, or you're going to go some other way. So if you're thinking about it, then then you're immediately sort of narrower. For me, that just falls right into the vein of sort of the Western uh, analytic philosophy. Because to me, I'm like, if you're thinking about something, why wouldn't you think about it super analytically? Like that, obviously, that's what you would do, but it doesn't work for everybody. So that's what I've tried to do in this book, is to say, okay, analytically, let's do it. And one aspect of that would be talking about and just pointing out, and this would be somewhat simpler than obviously several hundred pages of linear argument, but just talking about that idea of like of meaning. Like there's no such thing as meaninglessness. If you're talking to me about it, you believe in meaning, like just sort of pointing out the basics Same thing with truth. Same thing with this idea of logos, of you are a patterned being. You have a certain order and pattern that's functional and that carries through time. And you are a being that recognizes, participates in, and creates patterns. So it is a little bit weird because we have lost the conception of what logos means. So you have to introduce that as well as show someone that they are it. But just that sort of straightforward level of going back to the very basics of the fact that you are, again, having that notion that you're seeing something real that you can pass on to me that you believe in the truth. You also believe in your capacity to notice the truth. And, and really, that's it by itself. That means there is a logos and you participate in it just by those basic factors. So I think that is sort of the general core of it. And then if the more people who think about it, they'll find different ways to sort of build off of that and to appeal in different ways, how to relate that and how to make that known to people. But it can even move into, you can use the mental approach with art, like just the fact that you notice. I mean, art in that sense is the same as landscape. Like the fact that you notice patterns in nature or patterns in art, the fact that there's significance there means that you are a thing that notices patterns and that is affected by patterns because you notice them, because you have the capacity to be aware of them. Um, and then someone else would be a better person to contact about the other ways to go about that through the mind, because I'm just very like shoehorned into like, this is my approach, this is what I understand, and then someone's going to come up with something off of that. I'm like, I've never would have thought of that. But then you have, okay, let's say we're not even going to take an intellectual approach. Um, there's a concept that I like, that has a name in Hindu or whatever it is the Indian philosophy, Eastern philosophy world, is called darshan. And darshan means time, just like time spent with the master, the master's presence. And I think this is reflected also, we didn't have a word for it, but it's reflected in the Western tradition of discipleship, of in the ancient history up to Christ's period, and even after that, people went and learned from a master. I mean, you could think of apprenticeship even as a slightly lower form of this at least in the way we think of it in our minds. But again, I'm going to explain it intellectually, but just the fact that we are patterned beings, we have a pattern about us, and we participate in pattern and we make pattern. If you go and you go with someone, you are saturating yourself in their pattern. And the more so, the more that you are intimate with them, the more you spend every moment of your life with them, you are being exposed to their pattern and you are being suffused by their pattern and you're feeling them create and name patterns around them. So there's, again, I'm explaining this, so it's intellectual, but I'm talking about something that's not intellectual, about just living and breathing next to somebody. You're going to inherit by osmosis this whatever their pattern is, really, for the most part, but especially if you admire that person and they themselves are particularly aware, not intellectually aware, but particularly expert at practicing, or let's just say living the logos life, like being logos. Uh, then that is going to sort of exude from them stronger. And so the more you devote yourselves to them and the more you fall in line, then that is just going to permeate you and start to bring about that change in you. So I think broadly speaking, those are like the overall patterns. You have the intellectual uh, assessment and dialectic and argumentation and trying to get people to understand things conceptually. And then you have the pattern of just sort of inheriting it by being surrounded by it and suffused by it. And that can break down into multiple different ways. Like, if you're more direct of apprenticeship, you inherit the pattern of a carpenter by apprenticing to a carpenter. You're not inheriting logos itself per se, but an aspect of logos is the ability to follow this particular pattern of becoming a carpenter or whatever it may be. So there can be more directly action-based things of like learning a particular skill. And then while you're learning that skill, subconsciously, again, we're not talking about intellectual, but there's a part of you that is learning the skill of learning skills. There's a part of you that's being developed that along the lines of, as I'm learning, I am becoming a being who learns. And that presupposes the fact that you have the ability to recognize patterns and cultivate them and produce them and name them and that sort of stuff. So uh, I think there are actually a lot of ways to contract this. And really the anomaly is the modern day where for no discernible reason, people are very insistent on the fact that meaninglessness means anything, that we can't know anything, but they know that we can't know anything, that truth, like all these things are just nonsensical. And the fact that they're so prevalent and they're spreading, again, sort of like osmosis, um, is the vast abnormality. And for most of existence, we would go through our lives and just obviously take it for granted that we are part of the world and also makers of the world, you might say.
Yeah, I think of, when we were talking about association, being around certain people and engaging in activities with them and having whatever it is that they're doing rub off on you. There's that old saying that, you're an accumulation, or you're of the five closest people to you.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar to that. And you can see kind of that rampant exposure and spread of kind of this, I guess, disassociation from reality, this belief set of meaninglessness. Because in order to really fulfill the logos or engage in order, you need to be a direct participant in reality. And
Yep.
and you're seeing more and more kind of symptoms of that disassociation in people not really engaging in reality. One of the biggest problems, I think, is men, there's no initiation for men anymore. You kind of go through this robotic school system that teaches you some good stuff, but I mean, there's nothing there of substance in order to make you intrinsically a strong person. You might be able to find X algebraically, but I mean, couldn't really file your taxes, but at the same time, you're not learning how to be a strong version of yourself. And I think that over the years, there's been almost a real push to not have strong initiations, which would expose younger men, or just younger people in general, to more forms of order, and more, they'll be able to become apprentices and learn from masters and learn something long term. I mean, I think of the cathedrals that took decades to build. And so you had the grandpa that started working on it in his middle age, teaching his grandson, who he hopes is going to finish the project. And their whole lives are surrounded around the construction of this. And you see this and you're like, wow, what an incredible piece of architecture. And then you look at modern art. I mean, sure, there's some good stuff, but it's fatalistic. It's dreary. It's drab. It's simple. And I think that phones have a big problem with that too. It's kind of a black hole for our attention and our focus with no real benefit in reality. I mean, of course, it opens up crazy doors. You have crazy connectivity with anybody around the world. You can start businesses. You can do anything you want, sure, but the the transition into reality and the effect that a lot of these things have in the real world are essentially non-existent. And I think that people are starting to really disassociate with reality on that level and put more focus on the digital. And maybe that has some form of an outcome where your identity in the digital is having kind of a circular or back effect into reality where you start thinking that, they're the same thing. That real disassociation. Like if somebody thinks that they're a cat in a game and they want to be a cat, and then all of a sudden they're like, well, I need a litter box in the bathroom or something, but to kind of to meet those needs. So these are very interesting times, and we don't think about in the span of human history, we are just a small blip, but such incredible things have happened over the past decades. The harnessing of electricity, the internet, the automobile, flight, all of these crazy things are happening in such a short period of time. It's like if you were to look at this on a graph, it would just be an exponential curve upward. And so I think that a lot of people might are now starting to have, or you're starting to see issues, and I think it's only going to get more the more embedded this technology gets within us. You're mixing the iron and the clay. The more of that disassociation there's going to be. There's a really telling photo of Mark Zuckerberg walking down an aisle, and he's just walking confidently, and you see just masses of people on either side with those big Oculus goggles, just and it's maybe we're heading in that way, and there's that might kind of maybe that outcome is stemmed from the nihilistic belief of meaninglessness. Therefore, there's no firewall, there's no barrier to fall into this other version of reality because they don't have that strong footing of saying, no, this is real. This is divine order. This is man-made order. We'll go ahead and stick with the divine. Uh, but I think people and things are. I only think it's going to get worse. So I think that's the best way that we can do it, though, is to have conjecture, even though it may be fallible. Um, that we need to supply ourselves with grace to be able to have the courage to go and stand up and talk to people about this. But no, we're not going to reach everybody. Um,
Yeah.
and have patience because fundamentally it seems all you're saying is like, well, you're talking right now. You're talking with me about a subject, therefore there is meaning in that. Just the act of existence is proof that there is existence, and
Yeah.
so I mean the rebuttal might be, oh, well, there is no existence. This isn't real. I mean, sure, the moon's made of cheese. It's just wild. Okay, Rob, was there let's see. There's I think that now would be a good time. You put here in the back of the chapter kind of a summary of where we are, how we got here, just kind of a recap because I know we covered a lot of material up to this point. Just to kind of give people a little drink at the oasis before we keep going here. Um, could you kind of walk us through that, please?
Yeah, this is something I put in there, sprinkled throughout the chapters, some points where I go back and remind what we've concluded, and how definite, it may or may not be. And this is, part of my attempt to be more effective and to give people who aren't as influenced by just continuous intellectual argument, like a breather and refresher on, okay, what was the point of all this so far? So this is one of those spots after this chapter where I say, so far we've concluded some really necessary foundational things. And so number one, starting with chapter one, life is infinite. That's one thing. This is knowable, and I say a demonstrable truth in reality. That just it is the case that life is infinite. Um, then I would say human life and consciousness is meaningful, purposeful, significant. Those are all essentially a package deal: meaningful, purposeful, significant. They all basically mean the same thing. But our life and consciousness is significant. And this is in direct contrast to what I think is the core nihilist story, is that our consciousness is insignificant. I think everything stems from that hypothesis, that is not hypothesis, story that has wormed its way into our minds through whatever means. So life is infinite, human life and consciousness are significant. And then that was sort of the part one of the book, the bad mythologies and the opposing conclusions that we came to. Then we talked about causation. And so I say that causation as a certainty, causation is a deep and probably foundational element of reality, existence itself. We are both part of it and aware of it. That ties into the logos thing we were talking about. And we can act effectively through it. So we are connected. Therefore, we are connected in some deep and mysterious way to the basic functionings of the entire cosmos. So that ties in sort of the great mystery thing. And again, these are things that I'm saying are necessarily true. I think that they might sound out there, they might sound weird, but these are the things that through all of this argumentation, I think I've demonstrated these are basics, these are essential, these are foundational. So life is infinite, human consciousness is significant, human life is significant, causation is real, and we really participate in the great mystery of the universe. So then, since we are, that brings up the problem of, since we are effective, since we participate, we are both part of the world and we are world makers. As I pointed out in the last chapter, we by definition transform the world. We don't get to choose or believe that we are somehow wrong to be in the position of being transformers of the world. We are transformers of the world. We just get to choose how we transform it. So since we're effective, since we transform the world, and since we're fallible, we need to act for the good. And that's really difficult. And we don't know what that is. But the good thing is we do know step one, and that is search after the truth. Do all you can to find the truth. So that takes a lot of the pressure off for the moment of having to do the good, because the search for truth itself is good. So you're already doing good if you're truly searching for the truth. But that means part of what we talked about in this chapter, which maybe we didn't touch on, is that you have to sacrifice everything to the truth. The truth has to be the top priority over everything else. And then, so that's what we've got so far. Life is infinite, human consciousness and life is significant. Causation is real. We participate in it. And while we are effective and fallible and therefore dangerous, we can do some good things. And the one surefire good thing to do is to figure out the truth. That's where we've got so far. And then from this point, we have to start looking at conjectures. We have to start looking at things of like, well, what about this? What would we say about this? We can't just because I think that's the entire starting block essentially. That's that's what you can really adamantly know for certain. And then the question is, okay, now I'm looking for truths and I'm trying to figure out what's good. What now? Well, we need some raw material to be put in to process. We need some ideas about what might be good, what might not be good, and to see how they work out. So that's going to be the next step in the book is to take a look at some long-standing traditions of people considering what's good and what's not, and using those to try and figure out some more steps beyond just I'm going to look for the truth. Okay, we're in the process of looking for the truth. What now? What do we think might be some of that truth that we can add to ourselves um, beyond just this basic reality of we're in the midst of an infinite mystery that we're somehow participating in and responsible for and a part of, and we're significant but flawed. So there's danger, and we need to seek the truth. Now we need a next step.
Excellent. That's I wanted to touch on that as well. You brought up we didn't talk about it, and I think that it's really important that we do. Um, that's page 204. You say the intellect is not virtuous in itself, but only becomes virtuous through the service of and sacrifice to virtue. For the intellect and all else, that means that they must be prepared to lay down their own nature or their own creations upon the altar of truth. If they cannot do this, they cannot be virtuous. And that kind of just reminds me of picking up your cross and following of of bearing it. A lot of times it's not necessarily the most selfish way of living. You're disassociating from those carnal natures as one that just fulfills biological needs. Oh, I'm hungry. Oh, it's time to reproduce. Oh, it's time to sleep, and you're just a slave to that way of living. There's actually something beyond that, um, and that's the search for truth. That is absolutely the search for truth. And I think that if you can wake people up to this, that there is more than just the fulfillment of biological needs. I think that's the true evolution of having that thought of thinking that you are just this body, this carnal version of yourself that needs to fulfill those needs, when in actuality there is purpose and meaning and form that transcends that to an infinite degree. And
Yeah.
uh, and it's I think it's possible to make that shift, to utilize technology in this information age to kind of quell and push back on this nihilistic front that's just being pushed. And I think predominantly and primarily through um, school systems. I think that's a big one. And just the culture in general. But I think that there's major headway, at least on some degree, in some level, there is major headway. I see it on Twitter, quite often actually, and I don't know if it's just curated to the individuals that I'm looking at, but it just seems that there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of fallible conjecture, but conjecture and some good stuff in there. Um, Rob, was there anything else you wanted to add before we close out?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us for episode 10, chapter 9 of our walkthrough with Rob Davis's book, Purpose and Form, The Necessary Basis of All Ethics. You can find this book on Amazon. We're going to leave a link in the description down below. If you do decide to search for it on the Amazon website, please be sure to add Rob Davis in that search bar along with the title of the book, Purpose and Form. Otherwise, it will not show up. There's also a link to Rob's personal website with which lists all of his other works. And I think, Rob, you are finishing up or you have completed kind of a successor to Defund the Fun Police. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm still finishing it up. It'll hopefully be out in a month or so. I've got another book, a shorter book that I think I'm gonna put out right after the part one serial publication is done on Substack. So
Okay, so people will be able to, and they can access that on your personal website, right?
yep,
Excellent. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Please leave a comment if you found this engaging. Leave a like if you'd like. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and we will go ahead and answer them during next week's episode, which is going to be chapter 10, that is Christianity and Jung, right?
yep.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. All right. Well, thank you very much, Rob. Thank you, everybody. God bless, and may peace be with you.